When I came to Jesus, I settled it all. I gave him my life to control. Neither fear nor persuasion could draw me to Christ, but his love has captured my soul. I'm a prisoner of love, a slave to the master. I willingly toil through the heat and the cold, and to seek no reward in this world below. 'Cause payday will come, and payday when the pearly gates unfold.
Welcome, everyone, to Presbycast. That voice that you haven't heard in a long time, well, it's not your conscience. It's not the voice of the nation. It certainly isn't the voice of the ocean. It's just a guy on the internet who's pretty friggin' excited about Detroit Tigers baseball, but this isn't the podcast for that. We're going to talk about some other stuff, but welcome back to Presbycast. We're thrilled to be here. Got some lots of familiar faces, but I don't think that we've ever had this particular combination before. This could be the Chicago style hot dog of Presbycast guests that we've got right here. Someone has to play the role of the sport pepper, and someone else has to play the role of the celery salt, which, as we all know, tied the room together. So, welcome everyone. Chortles, I'll leave it to you to introduce our topic and our guests, many of whom we go back many an episode.
Well, I think first we should talk about our scheduling, because we've counter-programmed, presidential debates and what other major events that we've programmed opposite tonight. The landfall of a massive hurricane just happened minutes ago, so we don't expect anyone to be watching or listening live, but someone probably will. And we've got a somewhat, maybe a spicy topic tonight, could be slightly misunderstood. We do have a dream team here, and maybe one more will be coming in late, maybe after the first TV timeout. But for now, we're happy Resby's back. Resby, you've been sojourning in the wilderness of Goshen or somewhere, right?
Yep, or as I like to call it, the lower 48.
And you avoided the flooding where you
did.
were, but you weren't far from it.
Not super far from it. All of our freeway signs, when you get to the amber alert signs, they tell you, don't go this way. You will be prevented from going this way. And if you do have to go on that side of the mountain, then you have to go this other way. And they're quite stern about it, and for good reason. But there's a lot of pretty incredible grassroots support of people just coming together to help out their fellow neighbor up in that part of the state. I hate that it took something this destructive to show it, but there's an incredible amount of servitude and willingness to help out those in need left in this country that hopefully people will hear stories about for a long time.
Well, we'll have months to do that. We're also joined by Zach Groff, one of the rare Presbycast guests that's been ejected from the show and banned for a time, but he's here.
Thanks for having me back. Appreciate your grace.
He has musical piano accompaniment behind him, just like a charismatic black preacher. But that's just that's what's going on. We have Ryan.
We have a revival.
Okay. Well, mute yourself again so we don't have to hear it. Ryan Beasy, no stranger to the program, I don't think. And he's a pastor in my presbytery. He's in North Georgia. Zach is in South Carolina. And we have the Bishop of Festivus, past, next, present, and future, Dan Borvin, former OPC guy, now in the URC out in the People's Republic of California. So how are you, Dan?
I'm great. It drizzled the other morning, so we feel your pain in North Carolina.
Well, you'll rebuild, I'm sure, after an eighth of an inch of rain out there.
What North Carolina can do in a week, we can do in 3 decades in California.
Yeah. Yeah, well, nothing can be built for 25 inches of rain. I think we figured that out.
I used to work at a hardware store, and people would ask me, how do I keep water out of this? I said, eventually you don't. If it wants to come in, eventually it's going to come in. And, maybe I could have sold a couple more gallons of dry lock or something like that, but it's the truth.
All right. Well, our topic is it's a hot topic. It's all over. Just in the last week, there have been all these articles about the A word, Anglicanism, and its relation to evangelicalism and its particular attraction for many, especially younger people. But it's all the Anglican churches that are not Episcopal, which is the main line, very far left, liberal, fully egalitarian in every way. Episcopal Church USA. Any Anglican church that's not in that is now under the umbrella of ACNA. The Anglican Church North America now also includes the REC, the Reformed Episcopal Church, which used to be more Reformed, I think, and Zach knows a bit about that. We'll talk about that later. But we're talking about it's not just a different species of Protestantism. It's almost its own thing. It's almost a third thing, if that can be. And we'll talk about it. We'll try to figure out what it is. But I think it's also a useful foil for talking about our own denominations, NAPARC generally, PCA in particular, because we have more interchange with ACNA, and it seems to be a mirror and a photo negative of us in more ways than maybe of other denominations. So I'll do a little screen share to show one of these many articles. The main 3 are linked and will be linked in the show notes. You can click on them and read them if you want. But apparently the Anglicans are a pretty big deal. Now there are numbers to suggest that they are, and let's think about this. I don't know how many people are left in the Episcopal Church USA. Maybe it's a million and a half, but they're shrinking rapidly. But all Anglican churches have come out. There are Anglican church plants, but the churches that join ACNA have come out of the Anglican. The Episcopal Church, the mainline church. So these numbers are interesting. ACNA did not form until 2009. The Reformed Episcopal Church has been around much longer. It was much smaller.
Thanks, Obama.
It's now a part of ACNA. It's under the ACNA umbrella. But even though ACNA is only 15 years old, they have 130,000 members. That's roughly the 1/3 the size of the PCA. And then sort of the churches adjacent to NAPARC, adjacent to the PCA and other denominations that are similar in some ways to ACNA, and we'll talk about that, are the EPC, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, formed in 1981, and they have 120,000 members, so about the same size, though much older than ACNA. And ECO, the Evangelical Covenant Order of Presbyterians, the worst denominational name in the history of religion. But the ECO, they have over 100,000 members, even though they've only been around since 2012. And these are ECO is made up of what I call the last straw club. When the PCUSA made the decision to ordain any life form, I think it was, and allow marriages between any of those life forms, people started leaving. PCUSA. Can you believe that? Justice for Machen. But when you put those together, you have these left of NAPARC, well, I mean, certainly left of NAPARC, left of the leftiest parts of the PCA, and you add them together, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church, ECO, and ACNA, you have a denomination the size of the PCA, if they were one denomination, which they are not. But what they have in common is they are all at least optionally egalitarian. So that's one of the reasons we want to talk about this. The future of evangelicalism, the future of the vaguely reformed world seems to be being pulled left, pulled to the center seems to be moving to the left. I think the future is broad and egalitarian. I mean, we even see it with, look what happened with Rick Warren and Saddleback. You know, they're ordaining women now too. We are on the wrong side of all these trends, and I think that's something that's worth talking about. So, any thoughts from any of you guys just after that introduction? And I'm sure you have thoughts that are better than mine.
Chris Drew's here.
Yeah, you have to unmute yourself and speak if you want to say something.
I think I am unmuted.
Oh, you're good.
Okay, good.
All right, so you're an OPC member at an OPC
Right.
mega church in a place that it never gets above 50 degrees all year. But
It's so big they have to meet in a mall.
We meet in the mall. I liked what you were talking about Presbyterianism and some of the offshoot branches of Presbyterianism. I was actually at the ECO launch in Minneapolis, and what you said about that was right. It's a last straw club, but one of the reasons it became such a big deal and people and departing churches left the PCUSA over it was that up until that point, the EPC was sort of the destination, but many churches were reluctant to leave because of the EPC not compelling churches to ordain women. And it was John Ortberg who was preaching the sermon where ECO was announced, and he used the ECO letters to basically as his 3-point speech. He was a Baptist a long time ago. And one of the things he made a very big point of in that sermon was that they needed a denomination where faithful evangelicals could go that wouldn't just tolerate female ordination but actively celebrate it. And so that's how ECO, that really was the thing behind the formation of ECO.
Okay,
But I find this just
I didn't know that, so thanks for that.
Yeah, the discussion of evangelical Anglicanism is very interesting to me, and I'd be curious to go through some of the articles that you shared with me earlier on this, because it's some very interesting comments in those articles that I think will be worthwhile to look at.
Well, let me note something. The Episcopal, amazingly, and I'm sure a lot of these people are elsewhere now, but for decades, for 20 or 30 years, a lot of the leadership of Christianity today were Episcopalians, and a lot of them are probably Anglicans now. But I mean, the virus was inserted in the system a long time ago. That's my point. There's always been a kind of highbrow type who's embarrassed about evangelicalism, which we have some sympathy for, have often looked, even for the Episcopal Church, even up until recent years, you would have people who call themselves conservative, reformed-ish, serious people remaining in the Episcopal Church, but a lot of them are now in ACNA. And the thing to say about ACNA is the range and it's just incredible. There's such a range. Our friend Drew Collins, who is an REC minister, I think, he says most ACNA dioceses do not ordain women elders, but I think I read it's approaching 50% of the dioceses allow it. And I could be wrong about that, but it's a not insignificant percentage. And it's spread out geographically because ACNA has affinity dioceses, which means there may be churches all over the country in a diocese of affinity. And one of those affinities, like we'll talk about this, Church for the Sake of Others. How cool is this? The missional Anglicans, about 50 churches. C4SO, that's their, they sound like a Star Wars character. But C4SO actively, Chris, kind of requires and promotes female ordination. But there are plenty of ACNA and REC churches that don't have any interest in doing that. I get that. But anyway, thoughts from any of you other guys as we kind of set the table for this?
I think it's worth
I don't know a whole
mentioning-
lot about. Go ahead.
I just think it's worth mentioning that there are Anglicans beyond ACNA and the REC, but I don't know all the details about it, but it is a diverse umbrella term describing a broader range than what we've mentioned or even what we're looking at today.
Yeah, if there are Anglican micro-denominations, I don't know who they are. And Zach, turn your gain up a little. You're too low now. So, Dan.
So is the purpose of ACNA just to cover everything except for the gay stuff? Is that why they exist? Because it seems like they have every different micro doctrine under the sun except for condoning homosexuality. Is that the only reason they're not Episcopal?
I'm not sure it's that. I'm sure it's not that simple. But there are still charismatics in the Episcopal Church. There's a charismatic vein in ACNA. There's the Anglo-Catholics, and then there's the more Reformed. Our friend Miles Smith kind of bemoans all the evangelicals and the baggage that they bring in to ACNA. It's very complicated. So I think my basic take on ACNA is that there's just I don't know how to define it. I mean, I know how to, I can say here's the address for the presiding bishop or the archbishop of ACNA, but I think mainly I want to tell people that when somebody says I'm Anglican, you have no idea what that means.
Yeah. So who do they say no to? That's what I want to know. Who gets left out other than the
You,
homosexual?
Dan.
Well, of course I'm out. But if who wanting to come in gets left out? If it's Anglo-Catholic, charismatic, egalitarian, Reformed-ish, everything under the sun, who's not part of ACNA? Baptists, maybe, but
Well, actually,
Well, there are a lot of former Baptists going in.
Yeah.
So but we have that in the PCA too, and we're broad too. But we're not. I think that's one of the points. We don't have a charismatic movement in the PCA. I mean, there have been little blips over the years where someone advocated it, or maybe someone got busted for promoting it, or something like that.
Does Jesus calling count as charismatic in the PCA?
You've opened a sore subject, and you can close it. At this point,
Yes.
Ryan. So
the third rail has been touched.
yeah.
The correct answer is yes.
So, some of us have had enough fun with that in the last year. So we'll move on from that one. So any other thoughts before we drill down on a couple of more specific things? All right. So this seems to be especially appealing to younger people, and I don't know why that might be, but on colleges it's a big deal. We know there are Anglicans at Hillsdale. That's no surprise. But there's an article by Sarah Carter from just last month talking about the Wheaton to Anglican pipeline. Now, some of our listeners aren't old enough to know that Wheaton used to be the Harvard of evangelicalism. It's probably not considered to be as orthodox and evangelical as it used to be. But there, again, Wheaton and Christianity Today magazine are closely aligned. And there's been a shocking number, I think, of faculty and students at Wheaton become Anglicans. And there's even, I think there was even in this article, the PCA president of Wheaton made a joke about, just don't become Anglican, because it was so common. So are there, I mean, I've heard theories, but do you guys who, have real contact with real people all the time, do you have any ideas about why Anglicanism is appealing to college-aged young people?
But
The transcendent aesthetic.
Well, and I, in my notes, I have the question: is this just the emergent movement, the ancient future emergent movement, cleaned up a little bit?
Yeah.
When I was in college, we would see that at Grove City. There'd be, and a lot of it was folks coming from broad evangelical, and maybe some PCA, EPC, but that resembled broad evangelical. Not always, but I do think that the Anglicans do a very good job of outreach to that, that upper middle class, well-educated type, and giving, their history. And again, that, as you said, that transcendent awareness.
So here in the first sentence, this is in my notes too. Here in the first sentence of this article, for many students, Wheaton College is their first introduction to liturgy. So we got the L word right here at the outset. For liturgy, to some people, it's pretty much anything that's not liturgy-less evangelicalism. Anything but 4 songs and a sermon and an invitation. If there are more elements than that, it's liturgical.
And an offering and a request for money before that. We should be clear.
The one megachurch I visited, they did certainly take the offering, and they used sort of like, they didn't say Kentucky Fried Chicken on the side, but they were paper buckets that they passed around, which I thought was extremely economical, I guess. But liturgy, I mean, all Reformed churches have a liturgy of sorts. I mean, we have a structure with elements. But some people, when they think liturgy, they think vestments and incense and bells and the church calendar and candles. So that's not really what liturgy is. And in this article about the Wheaton students becoming Anglican, it's really just referring to things like saying thanks be to God after a scripture reading or reciting the Lord's Prayer together. And we would not consider that to be heavy liturgy, certainly. But so I think there's more to it than liturgy. I think it's the high church aesthetic. So let's try to define that. So, Dan, what does ACNA? Well, again, there is no average ACNA church, but a lot of them these days are tending towards Anglo-Catholic, which is a very, very high service, which involves things like bells, like when the name of Christ is mentioned or something like that. People
They have a
bowing.
mass.
Yeah, it's basically a non-transubstantiational mass. It's very, very interesting. But what do they have that we don't? What do young people, not stupid young people, and not people, not young people who sleep in on Sunday morning, but who get up and go to one service? What's their attraction to all this?
Well, historically in the United States, the upper classes were typically Episcopal and Presbyterian, and the lower classes were Baptist and Methodist. So it seems to me, based on this article from the woman at Wheaton, I'm guessing that many of these people are from upper classes. Wheaton ain't cheap. If you're going to Wheaton, you're not at poverty level. So it could be the upper class draw that they're rejecting some of the superficiality of their evangelical upbringing, and they're attracted, I think, as somebody said earlier, the highbrow aesthetic. Anglicanism, I think, in a good sense, promotes beauty. I think we in Reformed churches could have a little more dose of that, understanding aesthetics as a good thing, obviously within reason. But the Anglicans have always promoted beauty, and let's face it, they have cool outfits with the vestments and the bishop's mitre. We can't compete with that. My Geneva robe is so boring compared to these Anglican vestments.
Yeah,
But you have your you have your Festivus mitre.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, nothing can compete with that.
I think the vestments look ridiculous. But here's to piggyback on what you said, they're quote cool in an historical sense. There's a historical, at least the appearance of a historical rootedness, not just in Anglicanism, but also Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, that is attractive to a certain young person who feels the anxiety of rootlessness in a postmodern world and is looking for some kind of historical grounding or rootage, we might say, and finds it in these high church traditions or liturgical traditions. Now, that's not to discount the people who are drawn into conservative Protestant Anglicanism because they're more aligned, say, with the J.C. Ryles of history rather than, the mitre-wearing, surplice sporting kind of brand of Anglicanism.
Well, that raises an interesting point that someone who's probably one of you is more qualified to speak to this. But how much of what we perceive as Anglicanism today is simply the remnants of the Oxford movement? The vestments, the chasubles, and all of that. How if you walked into John Newton's congregation, would it be recognizably Anglican as opposed to what we see today as Anglicanism?
Yeah, let me throw in there. I was reading Albion Seed, which is like this, 2,000-page history of the migration to the USA. One of the groups are the Cavaliers, and their description of Anglicanism in colonial Virginia was that the liturgy was very plain, and that the ministers wore very plain attire, and this is early 19th century Oxford movement, the Puseyite, as they were called, and so yeah, Anglicanism, and even then in colonial Virginia, those Anglicans persecuted my ancestors, fining and imprisoning them for not attending the established church services and for attending intoxicated, and for that reason I oppose establishmentarianism, as everyone knows. Continue.
I just read recently that in much of, well, maybe not much, but in certain high-profile cases and instances, there's a lot of resistance to the introduction of hymns in Anglicanism, even in the early 19th century, 1820s in certain areas. And so, yeah, the whole high church phenomena, the Anglo-Catholic phenomena, Oxford movement, is an interesting historical wrinkle, and it's difficult to identify or to generalize about why people are drawn into Anglicanism for this, that, or the other reason.
And a lot of Anglicanism is so broad, and that is by design. So when we say Anglicanism, well, what do we mean? It's kind of like saying your typical PCA church. Well, what do you mean your typical PCA church? You've got everything from a cappella psalm singing to acrobats in a PCA church. Well, Anglicanism, as the third way or the Via Media, it's broad.
All right, I'm going to blow your mind. I'm going to skip ahead to the About page from the official ACNA website. Now, this in no way speaks for all Anglicans any more than some of the things you might find in By Faith or on maybe some PCA website speaks for all of us who are PCA. But this is pretty amazing. This is this is the corporate website for ACNA. And talks about the three streams. So we talk about the broad nature of this. And think about this relative to the PCA or any NAPARC denomination. There's no comparison. Three streams. The Anglican ethos holds together three streams of the Christian church. So they're saying, the whole Christian church is embodied in this Anglicanism, which is broad. That's the definition of broad. But I continue. For those familiar with church history, Dr. Les Fairfield, who I've never heard of, provides a synopsis of the history that shapes its life today. That is the Anglican Church. And we'll quote Dr. Fairfield. The Protestant movement recalled the 16th century church to the primacy of the word, written, read, preached, inwardly digested. The 18th century holiness movement reminded the church of God's love for the poor. I would add some other weird things that they did. And then the Anglo-Catholic movement, that's the Oxford movement that Ryan was talking about, regrounded the church in the sacramental life of worship. All three strands are grounded in the gospel. Each one extrapolates the gospel in a specific direction. No strand is indispensable. Other Christian bodies have taken one strand in an extreme. By God's grace, the Anglican tradition has held the streams in creative tension. I love creative tension. The miracle of unity is a treasure worth keeping. Now, the holiness movement was the forerunner to charismaticism, and there are charismatics in ACNA. There are actually charismatics in the EPC, believe it or not. But I don't know about ECO. But you see how different this is. You see how broad it is, and self-confessedly broad. So I don't know. I think if you take nothing else away from this show, if your neighbor or your friend says, "Well, I think I'm going to become an Anglican," you've got to ask a lot of questions, and you may be able to save them a lot of confusion and heartache by knowing just a little bit about this. Now, there are many faithful Anglicans who love God and try to live according to His Word, but we know the struggle of confessional Protestantism, that it's not easy, and I don't know how you would operate in this particular environment. I don't know. So the three strands, Chris, does that sound familiar to you in any way?
Who, me?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there were charismatics in the PCUSA even. And
Yeah.
Because they just associated it with conservatism and real religion somehow.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
fell into it.
Well, and kind of, there's sort of, this is me just speaking off the cuff here, because I'm not one of those folks, but it just sort of speaks to me as about a certain type of appeal that having a mystical experience seems to be engendered for some of these folks, with the idea of charismatic particular moves of the Holy Spirit. But I see that same kind of attraction even in some of these other things we're talking about with higher church liturgy, even the use of incense in some cases. That there's a sensory mystical element that is appealing to some folks who are drawn to Anglicanism. And I remember, when I was a young man in a PCUSA environment, I had friends who were Greek Orthodox, and they would invite me to come to them to visit their church on Sunday, which was in hindsight really exhausting, because I stood most of the time and was hard to breathe with a volume of incense that was used during some of those services. But the real thing that caught up a lot of people in that, and it even caught me up a little bit into it, was this sort of mystical element associated with the pronounced ancientness of the liturgy, the appearance, and how things were conducted during the course of the liturgy, was something that held a temporary appeal for me at one point, and I think is actually a big draw for a lot of people today. and that was part of the thread in some of the material I read preparing to come on tonight. There does seem to be a certain element of attraction to this that is rooted in the desire for something more mystical rather than something more commercial, which is what you would see in a more contemporary mainline or contemporary megachurch sort of model.
Yeah, I was struck by this line on the ACNA About page under worship. Anglican worship is diverse. It is best understood by visiting and attending a local congregation. And that can be said of a PCA too. But that's the nicest way you could say we're all over the place. And I guess there's some elements, and there's the Book of Common Prayer that ties together, and the lectionary that would kind of tie Anglicans together. In the PCA, there are churches that do very few of the elements, and they may be led by almost anybody. So there might be more on paper that ties Anglican churches together as far as worship goes, but there's so many intangibles. I think maybe ACNA and the PCA are similarly broad in worship. So one of the reasons I want to talk about ACNA is because it helps us think about our own churches as well, and honestly compare them. So, any thoughts on on the PCA? But we should say we formally have the regulative principle, and many of our churches adhere to it, which is to only do in worship what the Bible commands, not to do anything that's not commanded. That's called the regulative principle. The Anglicans pretty self-consciously, along with this is what they have in common with evangelicalism. They would adhere to the normative principle, which basically says we can do anything that's not prohibited. And I think maybe tradition holds nearly as large a place in Anglican worship in particular as it does in Roman Catholic worship. So thoughts on worship, because we like to talk about doctrine, but doctrine's reflected in worship, and people change churches because of worship probably more often than doctrine. So thoughts on that? All right. We have the magic
I found it
number
interesting.
of people. Yeah, no, go ahead.
I found it interesting that in one of the articles, Unexpected Anglicanism in West Virginia, it said Charismatic Renewal is one glue that is holding ACNA together. So is charismatic worship so prevalent that it's becoming the tie that binds? And how do you get charismatic with those vestments? I mean, it seems like waving your hands would be difficult with
that's
such a
always
heavy
been
robe.
It's always been my question. I never understood it. I don't think I ever will. I'm not gonna witness it firsthand. Our friend Drew, who's an REC minister, I bet you he can't hardly explain it. How
do the
that
sway
works.
babes wear vestments?
I will tell you this: I've had it on good authority. It's really difficult to handle snakes in a mitre.
I think that the vestments are a lot like the flags and the ribbons that charismatics use when they're running around and on top of the pews and waving the flags and the streamers. Vestments are kind of like that.
Well, I wonder, vestments, that's the professional attire of the 5th century, the 3rd century. And a Geneva gown was the professional attire of the 16th century, and the business suit is the professional attire of the 20th century. And it just strikes me as odd when you've got you're worshiping in for example, when I was growing up Lutheran, we were worshiping for a lot of it in a high school cafeteria, but our Lutheran pastor would come out with it in his white robe and alb and stole and all of that. It would just there seemed to be this dissonance between the space. Now, if you're in a great cathedral, I guess there's not that dissonance, but what is it about the garb that is so attractive? I've seen whole, web pages, not websites, but web pages devoted to why our pastor wears what he wears. It seems like that's more of a distraction.
I want to know how Drew Collins knows what a fetal turtle looks like.
Well, he's in South Carolina. They have those sea turtles. Surely that's what it is. Maybe he's saved some turtles. Maybe he's like a turtle midwife almost.
I think it's illegal to mess with the turtles.
Yeah, well, unless you're a licensed turtle midwife.
Or you're a Reformed Episcopal minister. And it can mess with the turtles.
Yeah. We love Drew. Okay. We should make that clear. We have, I know people who are personal friends with Drew, Allgood. And he used to be, maybe he used to be ARP. I think he went to Erskine. He'll let us know in the comments if we're wrong about that. But many of the befuddlements and questions we would have about all this, he would have too in some cases. So it's admirable when people can live together and get along and tolerate each other. And I think there's, just as we require some forbearance, so do all communions. But Anglicanism is a uniquely strange and appealing one right now for some reason, and we're trying to figure out why that is. That's the whole reason.
Brad, one of the things I wanted to talk about, and I'm trying to figure out if we're going to get there. We're pretty much as close as we've been right now. Is the establishing just how appealing Anglicanism is with some hard and fast numbers, particularly coming out of the Presbyterian Church in America. Something that I think a lot of your listeners know is you and I both have been tracking where ministers are coming from and where they're going when they're either coming into the PCA or leaving the PCA. And one of the very interesting data points is how many ministers are transferring out of, and I use the word transferring loosely here, but transferring out of the PCA, leaving the PCA to go and minister in ACNA or Tech or some other Anglican communion. And I don't know if now's a good time. Oh, here we go with the fetal turtle thing. Wow, he actually has a rationale for that. That's remarkable. But I don't know if now's the time to talk through that trend of seeing PCA ministers go into ACNA.
Yeah, and that's one of the only reasons we're interested in this is that, I mean, we are ecumenical. I mean, we do care about other Christians, and we care. And I should have said earlier, one of the reasons we're concerned about this is that our children, some of them, are going to be tempted to kids often go to different churches. Sadly, they often leave the faith. But we do need to be concerned, just like we've talked. We've asked the question: are mega churches actually a mission field? But we should be concerned with, our neighbors, even our near theological neighbors, like Anglicans. What's going on with them? But yes. So we've noticed ACNA more than maybe Dan or Chris would have, because we have ministers in church, maybe even in a couple of cases, churches going there.
Yep. So here are some numbers to throw at you. They're not astronomical numbers, but they're significant, and the trend is significant here that I've noticed. From 2012 to 2000, 2 PCA ministers left the PCA to join the ACNA. From 2021 through 2023, so 3 years.
Hold on. You said from 2000 to 2012.
Oh, I meant to say 2012 to 2020. I'm sorry. From 2012 to 2020, 2 Anglican ministers, or 2 Presbyterian ministers left the PCA for the ACNA. Just as a side note, I'm pretty useless after about 3:30 p.m., and it is like 10:15 where I am, so I'm pretty wiped out.
You and President Biden should hang out. I hear that he has pretty similar hours.
Is this called sundowning?
Something like that, man. President Biden and I do not have the same
Zach
taste
Roth
in
cheap
ice cream
tonight.
Yeah, that's right. All right, so I'm totally losing it. But from 2021 to 2023, we have had 12 men leave the PCA for the ACNA and 1 leave the PCA to minister in tech, according to the data
Which is
that
the
I've collected.
Episcopal
The
Church.
Episcopal Church, the mainline
which is a
church.
mainline, very
Yeah.
liberal church.
So, but we could say 13 have left the PCA for denominationally affiliated Anglican or Episcopalian bodies. A number of those have been RUF ministers who left the PCA to go pastor a church in the ACNA. I know there were a handful even of men in the Pacific Northwest Presbytery that left for ACNA. Now, I've only confirmed 1 church that left the PCA as a congregation to unite itself with the ACNA, but I believe that there are more than that. But I've only confirmed 1 with my conservative data analysis. So, but that's a remarkable trend, isn't it? From 2012 to 2020, 2 guys, and then from 2021 to 2023, 12 guys, plus 1 to the mainline church. That's quite the shift.
So, I mean, is this a sign of health because these people have seen that the PCA is becoming more reformed and less open to things like women officers, women pastors, very loose ecclesiology? I mean, again, it depends on the diocese. It depends on the bishop. The range of practice is astounding. Really, Lutheranism is like that too. It's extremely hard to define and very locally variable. I don't know of anyone that has a more defined, tighter order than the Presbyterian churches do. And maybe we just can't relate. But I think that's part of my contention is that the future in evangelicalism is, and maybe this explains, Zach, the guys who left the PCA. They wanted less structure, less restriction on what they could do locally, a contextualized ecclesiology, polity, which we've talked about before, freedom in worship, freedom. Maybe I don't think they were charismatics. Freedom to do paedo communion, which is all over ACNA, not prohibited, I don't think. So there's just a lot of freedom there, and it's egalitarian. So I think the future of evangelicalism is more egalitarian, more local freedom, and maybe I don't think most Anglicans are incredibly doctrinal, so less doctrinal rigor or constriction, precision. What do you think about that? I mean, it could be a sign of health in the PCA that we have people leaving to the left, or to the broad, or to the Anglican. What do you think about that?
I was talking to an RUF minister friend of mine about this because he's alarmed at how many guys that he's gone through training with have gone Anglican. And as you know, we've had conversations, kind of spitballing ideas here and there. Everything you brought up, we've discussed, but there's one thing that you didn't talk about. Anglicanism is a very political body, like any society of men, but at the end of the day, you're dealing with a bishop. You have a relationship with him. You can get coffee with the bishop. You can't really get coffee with the session. I mean, you can have coffee together as a group of men, but you know what I'm saying? You can't get coffee with the presbytery.
Well, now, hold on. You and Ryan Beasy hang out with the stated clerk of the PCA on the regular.
But he has no authority over us.
Okay.
It's not like he's our bishop. He's our. I like Brian. He's a wonderful partner at meals. He shares his food.
You just ate all his ribs. That's why you.
He sent it home with me. I mean, it was really generous of him. Of course, we picked up his tab, so I guess it was our ribs that we were sharing with him.
I'm sorry.
You.
It was the royal we. The royal we.
You paid for it.
Ryan
I didn't
Beasy,
even get a chance. You didn't let me. Ryan's very
Beasy,
generous.
he is one of the more generous and hospitable men I've ever met in my life.
He really is though, and he's a wonderful cook from what
And
I've heard.
I had the joy of returning some of that to him at my own house recently.
But anyway, back to my point here. Anglicanism, though it is very political, I'm not denying that. It's not political in the same way that Presbyterianism is. It's more personal. You have a personal relationship with your authorities, whereas in Presbyterianism we deal with courts, not individual hierarchs or prelates or bishops. And so I think that personal angle is attractive to guys in concept. Then they hop the fence and they realize the grass isn't greener on the other side, because that dude can fire you and you really have no recourse. and that's actually happened. A presbytery can't just fire you and you have no recourse. It works very differently in Presbyterianism.
Yeah, I profess not to understand the power of the bishops. I was listening to Miles Smith on the podcast with Daryl Hart, Corey Moss, who's Lutheran, and Miles Smith, all Hillsdale history professors. And it's one of the things about ACNA. I get a different take depending on who's talking about it. And I can't really define the ecclesiology very well. And there are different takes on the power of the bishops. And what you described, Zach, is kind of what I thought. I mean, there's a shortcut to discipline with a bishop. You don't have to wait for 2 or 3 years for a judicial case and appeals to go through, as you might in the PCA, as we saw with Greg Johnson and Missouri Presbytery. But you also have a shortcut, a short circuit to error, maybe, or to injustice. But you rightly identified process versus person, and that's really that's something to think about. And there's a piece I'll have that'll be out on the GRN site tomorrow, and it talks about that in the New Testament, elders are always found in plural, and you even had Peter referring to I'm just a fellow elder like you are. I forget which passage that's from. I've quoted it last Sunday, but the total depravity, in my view, demands a plurality of elders. It demands accountable courts, and Episcopalianism. And I think Miles was describing what ACNA has as sort of a modified Episcopalianism with a strong congregational element. That may be so, but it's a different animal than Presbyterianism. I think that's the point.
It's that desire that the profile of PCA minister that goes to ACNA, I think, is the same guy that wants to resolve conflicts over coffee and never resort to the processes and procedures that are outlined in our Book of Church Order, for example. Doesn't really want to say, well, let's bring it to the session for deliberation. He says, let's work this out over coffee. Let's get together and talk it out 1-to-1. And that's all well and good. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that impulse, and there's a lot that's actually commendable about it. You do want to resolve things, especially conflicts, without escalating into some litigious process if you can avoid it. But if you have like a shaking fear of the politics of Presbyterianism, for example, or the process, then you're probably not going to last very long in the PCA or the OPC or even the URCNA, which is far more of a confederacy or confederation of congregations than even the PCA is.
I often think of Dan as a Confederate general, but that's just me.
I'm working on the beard.
Yep, very good. You got the chiseled visage. That reminds me. I don't know how many of you have read Shelby Foote's volumes on the Civil War, but in the first one, when Jefferson Davis, who had this really, he's a really ugly guy. Just looked haggard. The way the Southern populace put the positive spin on how bizarre looking Jefferson Davis was, they said he had a wizard physiognomy. Which I always thought it was like, oh, she has a nice personality. It was sort of in that vein.
He's got a face for radio. There you go.
So what happens though if you get a bad bishop? Do you switch
Your life
diocese?
stinks.
Right, you're just under the thumb of this guy or woman in ACNA with immense power. Can you just switch to another diocese of affinity then? To me, that's the danger of episcopacy. Is one of the many dangers is you can get a bad bishop, and then what can you do with him?
Well, there's a lot you can do in
Or
our
her.
voluntaristic kind of reality of church life today. I think under an establishment, you don't have very many options. But today, yeah, you just jump into another group, another communion with along lines of affinity. See, this statement from Drew is insightful. American Anglican bishops would generally be shocked at the power that Presbyterians think they wield, and he's right about that.
And it says, Drew says women can't be bishops, so I'll just correct Dan. I didn't know of any, but there certainly are women pastors, and some of them call themselves priests, which is they are more sacerdotal than most Presbyterians. So that's and even in the Church of England, not all ministers call themselves priests, but some do certainly. And
Is
who
Beth Moore
are
a priest?
Anglo-Catholic. No. She's just an assistant. So let's talk about that. ACNA has this thing called canon theologian, and apparently you don't have to be Anglican to become one, because Ray Ortland, the thing I always think about when I think about Ray Ortland, besides his recent endorsement of Kamala Harris, more or less, is that he would often be pictured wearing a suede sport coat. And who doesn't look good in a suede sport coat? Resby, you have one, don't you? A suede sport coat? I'm almost sure Resby does.
I don't have a suede one, but I have a brown corduroy.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's pretty Anglican, corduroy or tweed.
I think the last time I wore it was to a wedding at an Episcopal Church, actually.
Very, very appropriate. And now I've lost my train of thought.
Just as a side
is
note,
like-
it's time to get your tweeds out. If you haven't done it yet, the season's turning. It's time to get your tweed jackets and suede sport coats out and start wearing them.
So canon theologians. That's what we're talking about. Ray Ortland is one.
He's technically a
Beth-
catechist and canon theologian.
Ooh,
canon theologian. Yeah, that's
A catechist and canon theologian.
fancy.
and Beth Moore now attends an Anglican church and was famously caught on video helping to serve the supper or carry the cross or process the Bible or something. So there
I think
are
isn't she and Ray and Mr. Moore all at that same church?
They're all in Nashville, right?
Yeah, I don't think so.
I think they're all in this. I thought they were all there.
Yeah, I don't know. There's sort of the Mandela effect. I imagine that Russell Moore had become Anglican too, but I don't think that's true. And I don't think Ed Stetzer is either. But boy, wouldn't it be something to see Ed Stetzer in the full vestments? That would be a wide shot, as they say. All right, so here's a question for the PCA guys. Is it better for some of our people to become ACNA? I remember scoffing at the idea, maybe around late 2000, 2008, 9, 10. I would hear ministers scoff at someone and say, oh, they're Anglo-Tyrians. And I thought, this is a low church guy who's kind of bigoted. And he's calling these guys Anglicans just because they have a little liturgy. well, maybe they weren't being so harsh. If we have people among us in the PCA, and I can think of a few that have some really weird liturgical elements in their worship that would be sort of Anglican. Is that a problem? Would it be better for some of those to become Anglicans and be happy and allow us to preserve Reformed worship? Thoughts on that, Ryan?
How did you know I had thoughts on that? Yes.
I don't know. You grew up Lutheran, so you know a little bit about liturgy.
Yeah, that's the thing. Is I grew up Lutheran. We had liturgy. I enjoyed the procession of the choir and the crucifier, carrying the big cross in and all of that as a young man. That was I liked that. I was very high church. But then I became Reformed, and I realized how problematic all of that was, and how unbiblical all of that was as elements of worship. So yes, when I see that in when I see that in Presbyterian churches, it just looks silly, and it's liturgical appropriation, I guess. Some people get very upset about cultural appropriation. Well, it is cultural appropriation, because what is a church's culture but its liturgy? And so when you're taking elements of worship from the Lutheran Church or the Anglican Church, the Oxford movement, really, it looks silly and you don't understand it. So yes, I think that Reformed churches, all I want from my Presbyterian church is for her to be Presbyterian in her worship, in her theology, in her polity. And when it looks more Episcopalian, Anglican, Lutheran, it's false advertising, and it's not honoring to our heritage or our theology.
I have some dear friends that are Anglican, some of whom used to be Presbyterian or used to be non-denom. I don't think there's anything shameful in being Anglican, but I want to echo what Ryan said and maybe put a finer point to it. I believe that Reformed worship, and particularly that which is expressed in our directory for public worship, even in the PCA, and certainly in the OPC and in other Reformed and Presbyterian denominations, even in light of our differences, that really is the best expression of biblical worship, the most faithfully biblical worship that's on offer in the world today. It's not perfect. We always need to be reforming according to the Word, but I desire for our Presbyterian churches to live that out as advertised. And if a Presbyterian church wants to worship like an Anglican church, I don't see why they wouldn't seriously sit down and think through, okay, what would it look like for us to actually become Anglican and be able to do this without being at odds with what we say we are. It causes me no little heartburn to have to qualify or do research before I can really recommend a particular congregation of the PCA or some other body around the country where I know there's a diversity of worship styles that goes beyond what I would generally see as acceptable differences in different areas. I don't want to recommend somebody to go to a PCA church. They get there and then there's like a processional at the beginning of the service or something outlandish, but here we are.
Well, and Zach, when you say, we are the finest expression of biblical worship, that again gets to the distinction between the regulative principle of worship and the Anglican Lutheran normative principle of worship, that when Anglicans and Lutherans sit down to plan their liturgy, they're not, and this isn't intended as a criticism. They're not looking at, well, what happens in a biblical worship service? We should do that. They're looking at what will be meaningful to this culture and that culture, because they have a different theology of worship, and that's important to understand.
Right. And that theology of worship is actually a lot closer to non-denom worship than it is to Reformed worship, just in terms of the principles.
Well, the Bible talks about worship in spirit and in truth, and the truth part is easy to, I think we find that pretty easy to explain, But the in spirit part is much more difficult, and I've never seen a perfectly satisfying exposition of worship in spirit. But I think it's got to, of course, it's according to truth because it's according to God's character. And if we have a good theology proper, that's going to inform our worship. But the intangible of reverence, as we find in Hebrews, with reverence and with awe, our acceptable service of worship, I think we could say one of the reasons that people are drawn to something like Anglicanism is a failure of reverence in our Reformed churches, in the PCA in particular. So let's talk about reverence in worship, what it is, how it's achieved, why it's important, and whether we have it. So I'm going to let you go first, Dan, because I got a feeling URCNA, Continental Reformed, that you all are more, I don't know, culturally or genetically reverent than we wild Scotch-Irish are, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, maybe so. I mean, there's probably not as much diversity in terms of liturgy and overall style of worship in the URC as there is maybe in the PCA. I think most of our churches, you would get a sense of reverence in them, in the worship. And I think that would be appealing to those evangelicals, former evangelicals, who are looking for more substance in worship than they're finding in their evangelical churches. So you don't have to go to Canterbury to find reverence. You can find it in NAPARC churches, including the URC.
Yeah, that's I've been telling people lately, it's never been easier to stand out as an APARC church. We have something that people are looking for, and that they're not going to find in many other places, and that is reverence and seriousness and worship. The RPW, singing psalms, singing good hymns. Who's doing that? Your Baptist neighbors aren't doing it. No, the mega churches aren't doing it. It's never been. We ought to be able to just open up the doors and get a crowd these days. The way I think people are starved for proper worship, but reverence is a part of that. So we haven't. I want to hear what reverence is, though. Chris, give me. I bet you can describe what you believe reverent worship is, and what its value is, and even what its appeal is to the modern.
Well, for me, reverence is having a proper biblical fear of the Lord. It's recognizing you're coming into the presence of an all-holy God, that this is a serious time of joyful expression of thanksgiving for the grace we've received through the life, death, and resurrection and ascension of Jesus Christ. And that our spiritual worship is rooted in the knowledge that we meet with this holy God every Lord's Day. And so this is not something what we're undertaking here is joy-filled, but never fickle or foolish or lackadaisical or off the cuff, because God is worthy and we are sinners. And when we come before a holy God, we come with the most we can bring in terms of our admiration, love, affection, joy, and when we worship. And so that for me is the core of our understanding of what it means to be reverent. It's an inner disposition of the heart that recognizes the tremendous gap between a holy God and this poor wretched sinner who's only here by grace. And if we forget that or alight it, then we'll put other things in to cover it up. And I think for me that's reverent worship.
Ryan, Mr. R is for reverence. What can you tell us?
Yeah, I agree with what Chris has said, and that we recognize that we're coming before a God who is a consuming fire. And so we're coming reverently, but we're rejoicing with trembling, like in what Psalm 2 describes, that we kiss the Son, lest we perish, and we rejoice with trembling because he is our God, but he's our Father. And there is that beautiful picture of the fatherhood of God that even now as an adult, I still revere my father, and yet I'm overjoyed when he comes to visit or when I go to visit him. And we see that in biblical worship, that joyful honor that we give to our Father when He invites us to His house to meet with Him and to speak to us and to tell us about Himself in the preaching and in the reading of Scripture and worship.
So, one of the things, we haven't mentioned this yet somehow, that, and I barely alluded to it earlier, is Anglicans have great reverence for many the Book of Common Prayer, some version of it. I think Drew uses the 1928, and then there's earlier ones that you find, 1662, I don't know, that maybe some Anglican churches would use, some Church of England churches would use. We don't have a Book of Common Prayer in the PCA. One of our things is that we don't ban written prayers, but we don't have to use them. There are reasons for that. There was the imposition of worship and liturgies in Scotland in particular that was resisted and resulted in many things we now know as Presbyterianism. But do we need a book of Presbyterian prayer? Do we need a binding Presbyterian directory for worship? Possibly. Do we need the free? Would that help? Would that help with reverence? I mean, there's something about, I used to have sheep years ago. Sheep love predictability. And if you change their food a lot, they die. Okay? And if you keep them confused all the time, they run off, or they break down mentally and physically, because especially, we talk about how the relation between the mind and the soul and the body, how a problem in one causes problems in others. Sheep have little bitty brains, so if they have big problems cognitively and mentally, their health goes away. It just they're done for. But our people and us are the same way. I think predictability is important. So, do we need? I know some of you are going to be against it, but do we need a book of Presbyterian prayer? Do we need, as a denomination, 4 liturgies? And let's just pick one, but use one. And do we need more predictability? That's my question for any and all of you.
Well, we in the URC don't have a Book of Common Prayer, but we do have a book of forms and prayers, and we are required to use the approved forms by the Synod in our sacraments. So we have to read one of the forms before the Lord's Supper, before baptism. And our forms are great, number one, but also they prevent much error from swerving into the service. I've been in Presbyterian churches, Reformed churches around the world that don't use forms. And many of the explanations of the Lord's Supper have been, in my experience, Zwinglian at best. The form saves you from swerving into error when you're speaking relatively off the cuff. And just to add one more thing to the discussion of reverence, I echo what has been said, but also that I think part of reverence is worshiping as God has commanded us to worship Him. And that's why we're such strong believers in the RPW, that God has informed us how He wants to be worshiped, and we must abide by that in order to worship Him with reverence and awe.
And, arguably, and I think maybe Zach and Ryan would agree, our chapter on the sacraments in the Directory for Worship is constitutional, and you're pretty much told what to say. Now, most ministers take minor liberties, but just as you're told what to say when you elect officers in a church and when you admonish someone, when you excommunicate someone, in certain contexts, we are told in the PCA what to say. We don't always do it, but we don't have four forms for the Lord's Supper. If you read the BCO, there are certain things that you as ministers are supposed to say and include, maybe in your own words, but we don't have as much liberty as we seem to take. We take a lot, but we don't rightfully have as much as some of our guys think they do, I think. What do you think about that, Zach?
You're right. I mean, it's right there in the corresponding chapters of the BCO. There might not be exact scripts that are provided to us, at least not for the administration of the Lord's Supper, but even for baptism, there are certain questions we ask, and when we admit someone to the table and administer membership vows, we have to ask those as they are written in our book. We don't have liberty to deviate from those forms, you might say, or scripts, those particular questions. When a man's ordained, he has to answer particular questions. Now, there is a great deal of liberty in terms of the actual content of, say, a charge to a minister or an explanation at the table, an exhortation from the table, how we fence the table, not what we do when we fence the table. That's held in common, but the words we use, what passage of Scripture we use for the institution of the Lord's Supper every time we serve, we're given some liberty there. But you're right. I mean, there's a great degree of standardization, at least surrounding the sacraments, in our corporate worship. Whether or not that's upheld is another matter entirely.
Chris, what about the OPC?
The OPC, in its binding directory for public worship, has formularies to describe certain actions which are required and some that may or shall, the may versus shall kinds of distinctions. And for example, when we administer the supper, you shall read the words of institution. You shall summarize before the congregation the teaching of the Word of God as to the meaning and nature of the sacrament. And then it gives a form, but it says, and these are like words. So we do have forms like that are helpful to ministers. And I was thinking of actually the exact thing that Dan mentioned in his recommendation of the URCNA Forms and Prayers book, which I have actually in the pulpit with me at my OP church in Grand Forks. It's a lovely volume. And it preserves you from error. It keeps you from... if you ever feel tempted to innovate for some reason, it can keep you grounded and on track. It's just a good resource. And there have been historically big debates about that in Presbyterian circles. I remember coming across years ago a book, I think it's called Eutaxia. I don't know if any of you men have ever heard of that.
Yeah, by Baird. You can find that free online. Yeah.
It's a very interesting read, making an argument for the use of forms in Presbyterian worship. And I think it goes through some of the things that we've just been talking about here.
And I think he was new school. I don't think, some guys would recommend that entirely, but it is very interesting. And there's a lot of resource in there. Right.
Yeah, the book is interesting in that it actually is a pretty good summary of the arguments both for and against. He was for the use of the forms, but he understood the arguments very well. And I think it's a valuable book. So if you do look that up, it's good.
Yeah, that's EUTAXIA, I think by Baird, and maybe James Baird, but I'm not sure about that. BAIRD. You can find that. That was helpful to me as a new Presbyterian. I remember spending a lot of time in that book. Somehow the best thing I read in officer training, which is First to be a Deacon, was Terry Johnson's book on Reformed worship. That's what made me a Presbyterian. So worship.
Can I say one other thing? One
Yes.
other thing about our Reformed brothers in the URCNA, the Forms and Prayer book is interesting because some of the prayers, for example, the invocation at the beginning and some of the prayers of confession are derived directly from the Anglican Church. They come from the Cranmer form.
Yeah,
And
we
they're
often
very
use
good. And
we
I
often
know
use a lot of Presbyterian ministers use the Anglican wedding service.
that, and I think the graveside service is also pretty good too. I think our friend Ben Glazer uses that as well. So
I
yeah,
almost always use the BCP for funerals and graveside.
yeah. So we can give thanks for our Anglican friends for some of those forms because they're very good.
I hope we've said enough to help people think about these things, and I think that there are things we can learn from the Anglicans. I mean, negatively and positively. I think one of the negative things is this idea of affinity. I'm going to use the word presbytery because they say diocese. We would say presbytery. But we don't need non-geographical affinity presbyteries. That's just a bad idea. That's always a compromise to hold a too broad communion together. It's still that, well, these people won't be a problem if they can get together and play with their friends, and rather than argue with the people that they don't like who live near them and who don't have anything in common with them. So, I think I remember entertaining the idea 7-8 years ago. Well, we may have to have affinity presbyteries in the PCA, but I now realize that was a terrible idea. The regional church is a thing, just like the local church is, and we need to avoid that. So I don't think there's any movement to have affinity presbyteries, but we can build our little tribes, and that become sort of like affinity presbyteries or conferences or whatever.
Brad,
But, yes.
if we had a Presbycast affinity presbytery in the PCA, how often would we meet every year, and would I be in it?
That's one of the most. It's an offensive thing that you've said. So not even going to dignify it with
It's a serious
an
question.
off the cuff Starkey remark.
Well,
It's a serious question.
the idea
Can
of
I s-
affinity presbyteries is just so anti-Presbyterian because of jurisdiction and the purpose of a presbytery to govern and oversee the preaching and teaching within a geographic bounds. But
Okay,
I
you've
do
not
like-
given me any reasons for why we can't do it. You've given me reasons for why we shouldn't, but not for why we can't.
I might join the PCA if you do that.
Well, yeah. You should join anyway. Brad already said you look like a Confederate general.
No, it's the Confederation. The URC is a confederation. It's a play on it's an ecclesial pun.
So, another reason to have forms is it not only protects you from the minister, just innovating, but it also protects you when the minister gets nervous. Do you remember there was a general assembly? I think it was my first general assembly. And the man fencing the table got nervous or something. And he started talking about Confederate Memorial Day while fencing the table.
At a
And
PCA General Assembly?
I think it was in Houston. I'm not.
Inconceivable.
So, if we had a form that this is what you do, it will prevent the mention of Confederate Memorial Day at worship and definitely at General Assembly, Lord's Table fencing. So,
Confederate memorials are not in the URC approved forms, just so you know.
okay, well, yeah.
Although, you're gonna start talking about Anglicans and Confederates, you got to talk about Robert E. Lee was Episcopal, the Bishop General Polk or Bishop Leonidas Polk, who I think was a bishop
fighting bishop.
and a bishop. But yeah, they were a thing.
Evidently, Longstreet was Dutch Reformed, but then became Roman Catholic.
Whoa.
Yeah, well, Longstreet.
But I don't really know much about the war between the states. I'm from Philadelphia.
Beware the Southern Dutch. I think that's
All 5 of them.
except the URC plant in Birmingham. We hope that does well. But
There's a pretty good URC church in Pantego, North Carolina.
I didn't know that.
I preached there a couple times. I think it's just the plant in Birmingham, and then the one in Pantego, which is east of Greenville, North Carolina. The only two URCNA churches in the American South. There's some in Florida, or like one in Florida.
And until
We're slowly invading the
until your
South.
toes are in the sand, there's not much east of Greenville, North Carolina.
There really isn't.
No.
It's coastland. Pretty place, though.
All right. Well, I don't think we've been terribly offensive, and we've been corrected in the live chat when we've been wrong.
Yeah, Drew's
And,
been very active in the live chat.
And I knew he would be. I actually thought about inviting him on, but I thought no, he'll do a better job correcting us
The only Anglican we need on this podcast is Tucker Carlson.
Man, that would be epic.
He's an Episcopalian, and he's getting
but
kind
he's
of creepy.
thoughtful.
Okay, politically maybe, but he's a little. I'm not the fan I once was. I'll leave it at
I'll
that.
do it if I can do it in tighty whities.
Yeah. And so is that guy Russell Brand. Is he? What is he? Is he Anglican?
Yeah.
We could start the rumor. What?
I don't know, man. He's
Who knows?
very active on Twitter.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been interesting. I'm sure some people have learned some things, and I'm sure we made some mistakes, but that's what Wikipedia is for. And we want to encourage everyone to do your own research. Don't believe in I'm now seeing that Russell Brand may be sort of Roman Catholic. We didn't talk much about Anglo-Catholicism, but that's the part that bothers me, I think, the most about the ACNA is that trend. I mean, I know a lot of REC churches, part of ACNA, are good. My wife especially was traumatized when we went to an REC church while traveling, and it was different. Pastor was a former Methodist. Get this, Dan, you're going to like this, with an eye patch, and just added that special something to the whole experience. But it was little cabinets in the wall where the wine was kept. And salt.
Did he preach in
and
pirate
bells.
talk?
No.
REC.
Cabinets, literally just liquor cabinets. I mean,
Yeah.
that's what it's a wine cabinet.
Yeah,
This
a lot going on.
This is a word we didn't use. Eclectic. Anglicanism is very eclectic.
Yeah.
And
It's
I
a
don't think that's,
menagerie.
I think that's by design.
By design,
Going
the
back
third
to
way.
Via Media.
The via media. Eclecticism. The English
Well-
are pretty eclectic. I mean, they had a worldwide
Oh, yeah.
empire.
Yeah.
There's everything.
Well,
Fun.
and there've
Never
always
said.
been Arminian Episcopalians. There've always been Calvinistic ones. There's there's Anglo Catholics, and there's a lot of super woke stuff in the Church of England now.
They want to drop the word church from Church of England.
When I visited
Will they just call it of England?
Something like that, yeah.
when I visited
Hogwarts.
Canterbury earlier this year, and this is where the Canterbury Cathedral is, the seat of the Archbishop. There was a complex of buildings around the cathedral, and they had windows. You could kind of walk by and look in on these people, and there was a lady that had all the rainbow and intersectionality flags and everything. And I took a picture, and she noticed, and she didn't like it. She gave me the Episcopal stink eye, the Anglican stink eye, and
Was she worried you're taking a picture of it would steal her soul?
I don't know. I was taking a picture of her flags, but I'm just saying.
Yeah, the soul of the
But-
flag.
Yeah. So
you-
eclectic and
when
the
you say-
options.
When
Go
you
ahead.
say Anglican stink eye, I think of Mr. Bean.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So the eclectic thing is very, it's options, it's personal, create your own adventure, build a bear, all that. And that is appealing. And as we talk about Anglicanism being the future, maybe that's one of the reasons people like that. But we actually want a little less eclectic. Easy for me to say, the E word, ism, in the PCA and in our own denominations. So endless variety and variability, often a bad sign. So any closing words from you guys as we hit our traditional hour and a half mark?
Well, I think the great tragedy is that the Anglicanism of the 16th and early 17th centuries is not known by many, in that it was a Reformed church, especially under Edward VI and the first BCP, and the 39 Articles, when interpreted properly, are very Reformed. And they sent delegates to the Synod of Dort. And it wasn't until after the English Civil War and the Act of Uniformity that it began to broaden. And then, of course, as we mentioned, in the 19th century, the Oxford movement and so forth. But my desire is to see real Reformed Anglicans take up that mantle and be strongly confessional Reformed Anglicans. I would love to see a separate denomination that is a confessional Anglican church.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I was going to say earlier. For the impressive size that ACNA has achieved in a short time, they're probably going to split, like Presbyterian denominations are wont to do, and then I don't know that ACNA is never going to be in fraternal relations with NAPARC or a part of NAPARC, but conceivably a Reformed Episcopal Church that was more explicitly Reformed. Well, it could be maybe one day.
I think the Reformed Episcopal Church is in communal with the PCA, isn't it?
Well, it's probably corresponding relations. I think. Yeah. I think that's right. But at any rate, they're not going to be a part of NAPARC anytime soon.
They're not Presbyterian.
Well, yeah, and I think the women elders issue, as it now stands, would be a bar. So, all right. Well, thanks a lot, and Resby, if you're awake, you can. I think you should just roast everyone on the panel except me as we go out the door. You could do that in a succinct way.
I probably could. I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings, but I don't know. I'm always reminded. My favorite is, if anyone has the time, and I may have even said this on the show, but speaking of roast, the roast of Bob Hope is available on YouTube, and it's just a laundry list of jokes that you can't really say on television anymore. But it's hosted by Dean Martin and Sammy Davis Jr. And they just give each other, they just talk trash at each other the whole time. But Billy Graham is a roaster, holds his own. Governor Ronald Reagan is on there, and he always had one of my favorite jokes. He was like, this day was voted as Bob Hope Day in the state of California. I vetoed it, and it's one of the great deliveries that I've ever watched. So everyone should go watch that. Maybe I'll do a roast one time, but it's too late, and I'm not thinking properly. So thank you, everyone, thank you to all of our eclectic guests for this eclectic topic that only this semi-eclectic show could do. Look forward to seeing you guys on the other side of the episode. Don't be a nerdman.
My soul doesn't want to be free. I'm a prisoner of love, a slave to the master. I willingly toil through the heat and the cold, and a signal reward in this world below. 'Cause payday will come, payday, when the pearly gates unfold.
What's wrong with you people?